Welcome. It's very good to talk to you, Andrew. I'm very pleased to be discussing Tibetan Buddhism with you, a subject about which you're obviously extremely knowledgeable. And maybe we could start at the ground level by having you explain what Tibetan Buddhism is. How does it differ from other main lines of Buddhism?
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you for the opportunity. Richard, I look forward to spending this time with you. Tibetan Buddhism is virtually synonymous with Tantra or Vajrayana. And as you probably know, in certain classification schemas of the entire corpus of Buddhist teachings, which of course is enormous, one classic schema that is used are the three yanas, the three vehicles. The Hinayana, which is mostly known these days as Theravada, which is really gaining a wonderful exposure through the mindfulness movements and a host of really skillful teachers in that arena. Then there's the wider vehicle that's literally called Mahai or great wide vehicle. Theravada, you could say, or Hinayana, is like the narrow vehicle, the individual vehicle, where you're cleaning up at home. You're working with your own stuff. You're working with your own mind. And of course, these classifications are they cross-pollinate. They're not hard, cold, fast classifications, but they do have interesting kind of heuristic value. And so Mahayana is a little bit wider, bigger. You get up off the cushion, so to speak, and you're more interested in engaging in reality and in the world at large, so to speak. And then the Vajrayana, i.e. Tibetan Buddhism, Tantra, literally the indestructible vehicle. It's basically a subset of the Mahayana, where you take the fundamental teachings presented in the greater vehicle, the wide vehicle. But what distinguishes Tantra is its vast array of skillful means. Sometimes it's called Upayayana in Sanskrit, which means literally vehicle of skillful means. And that's one reason, Richard, why I'm so attracted to it, because it has dream yoga, sleep yoga, Bardo yoga to prepare for death. You name it, there's a meditation designed for it. And so that perhaps is one of the greatest distinguishing factors, is that it has this incredible armamentarium or skill set that allows you to work virtually with any state of mind under any particular condition.
Wow, that's fascinating. Well, let's pick up on one thread, which is Tantra.
Okay.
And Tantra is a term that's widely used,
right?
Possibly misused, and possibly misapplied, at least in people's minds, to the tradition you're talking about. Could you explain what Tantra is?
Yeah. Well, the word really comes from a root that means like thread or continuity, gyu, and it relates to this marvelous notion in the Buddhist teachings, especially obviously in Tantra, of the thread, the continuum of the awakened mind. And that means that under any circumstance, irrespective of what's happening, and this again ties in a little bit to why there's so many skillful means to pointing this out, that no matter what circumstance you're in, sleeping, living, dreaming, dying, the awakened condition, the awakened state is always indestructibly available to you. And so that's one way to talk about Tantra in a kind of etymological sense. But there's so many really interesting characteristics of Tantra. One that I really appreciate is that in Tantra, body is as important as mind. And so it engages in a really sophisticated bidirectional process where, when we're engaged in traditional meditations, it's more of a kind of a top-down effect. You're principally working with your mind. You're working with mindfulness, with awareness, vipassana, and the like. And there isn't a particularly overt application for how that works with either gross or subtle or very subtle bodies. And so a distinguishing characteristic of Tantra is it engages not just gross body to work with gross mind, it engages subtle body to work with subtle mind. And this is where things like dream yoga and generation stage meditations come in. And then even more compellingly, it engages extremely subtle body to work with extremely subtle mind. And this is what you do in the complete formless meditations and things like sleep yoga or luminosity yoga, where you work to cultivate awareness actually in deep dreamless sleep. And so this is somewhat interesting to me. I think it was Spinoza in Western philosophy had this kind of interesting approach to mind and body that would apply here, that on one level, mind can be looked at is very subtle body. Body can be looked at it as very gross mind. But fundamentally, it's really this bidirectionality that you can use bottom-up or top-down processes to engage. And this is where the whole kind of Tantra thing, people almost always say Tantra, they think of tantric sex. Well, that's a particular dimension of our experience. And one can, in fact, engage in these energies, the energies of passion, the energies of desire, because in the Buddhist cosmological schema, we live in this realm that literally is called the realm of desire. And so what's so really skillful here is what Tantra does, and this is where it can get a little bit tricky, it's a kind of prescription strength spirituality, if you will, because the practices can go directly into some of their principal problematics in conditioned life, like passion. And what Tantra does is it'll go directly into this passion using some of these practices that are so distorted in misunderstandings of Tantra, and it transforms the heat of passion into the warmth of compassion. And so I'll pause there because there's so much more to say about it, but I think that's important because a lot of people just, as you know, they get so lost in Tantra, they don't really understand what it is. And one thing that's very important is in the Tantric teachings and practices, often it says the preliminaries are more important than the main practice. And so in order to really engage in Tantra properly, you have to have a very solid grounding in the Theravada and Hinayana approaches and all the kind of restraints and structures that are associated with that marvelous approach. And then in addition to that, you have also the vast skill set of teachings that are engaged in the Mahayana. And so using a kind of Hegelian term, Vajrayana Tantra transcends but includes its predecessors. So it includes both Hinayana and Mahayana and also transcends them. In other words, it just goes a little bit beyond. But I think something like that may be enough to set some things in motion.
Okay, good, very good. Could you tell us a little bit about deity yoga?
Oh, there we go. Yeah. Yes, this is okay. Now we're going to the deep end of the pool right away. So deity yoga is a massive aspect of tantric practice, and I've heard some scholars kind of articulate there are three main bodies of tantric meditation. The deity yogas, which I'll get to with some specificity, is arguably 1/3 of that. Then you have the inner yogas that I intimated before, where you work with inner subtle body processes. There's an entire 1/3 of Tantra associated with that. And then the final third would be the really super subtle, formless meditations. And so when we're working with what's called deity yoga, we're also working with what's called generation stage meditation. And a very interesting term is also sometimes called evolutionary yoga. And so what you do here, Richard, that's really quite compelling with deity yoga is you visualize yourself as a deity. And there's many. And each one of these deities, by the way, the deity principle refers to archetypal dimensions of the awakened mind. So let's say, for instance, I'm engaging in the deity yoga, the deity meditation of Chenrezig, who's the deity or the bodhisattva of compassion. What I do is I visualize myself as this archetypal form. I engage in mantra recitation, which also is central to not only Buddhist, but Hindu Tantra. I mean, to such an extent that in the Buddhist world, another synonym for Tantra, Vajrayana, is mantrayana, the vehicle of sacred sound. And so what you're doing fundamentally is you're creating a kind of harmonic where a little bit like I was alluding to earlier, that if the fundamental assertion of the tantric traditions is true, that the awakened state of mind is always already present, then when you're engaging with deity yoga, it's as if I'm a musician. So if you're working with something like sympathetic resonance, let's say you have two keyboards side by side, right? I'm a pianist, and I hold middle C down on one piano, but without having the hammer strike the strings. And then I plunk middle C on a piano. Of course, you know what's going to happen. The first set of strings are going to vibrate. And so one of the things that deity yoga does is it creates this kind of harmonic of body, speech, and mind using mudra, mantra, and visualization that then in tantric theory is designed to invoke these kind of energetics, these harmonics from the universe at large, so that you can then kind of elevate, hence the notion of evolutionary yoga, You can use it as a way to evolve the matrix of your being from Joe Schmo, or in this case, Andrew Holecek, a confused sentient being, into the archetypal manifestation of awakened compassion, who is Chenrezig. And so it's a marvelously sophisticated practice. I've done it for decades. It's something that initially I said, okay, like what am I doing here? What is it all about? And I realized the more I did it, it's tremendous profundity and applicability. Because one of the things also, Richard, that the Tantra does that makes it so skillful is it takes whatever is available. Like interesting, we talked briefly about this whole kind of tantric sex thing, the passion thing. It takes, in that instance, passion, transforms it into compassion. In this case, what it'll do, it takes processes that we're already engaged in that we may not be aware of. In other words, we're always involved in a particular type of generation stage visualization thing. A central part of deity yoga is, in fact, visualizing. You're visualizing yourself as a deity. And whether we know it or not, we're always visualizing ourselves as certain kind of bandwidths of our identity. We're always involved in visualization. And I think it was the great Bengali poet Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, once said, the greater the imagination, the less imaginary the result. And so we know even colloquially that if we want to attain particular experiences or whatever, often a visualization will be guiding us, right? I want to be like this person. I want to be I want to be like this role model. And so we're engaged in visualization practice all the time. We're engaged in mantra recitation all the time, whether we know it or not. We're reciting mantras most of the time in the untamed, untrained, non-meditative mind. The mantras of the form me, 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 me. Mine, 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 mine. It's all highly self-referential. And we also have kind of poverty mentality mantras that we recite. Oh, I'm a loser. I'm a loser. I can't do this. I can't do this. So we have this subconscious kind of anti-deity practice happening all the time. And so the skillful means, and dare we say genius of Vajrayana and even deity yoga is, okay, let's take this fundamental principle. Let's bring that unconscious process into the light of consciousness, which is, is part of the psycho-spiritual vector of development and liberation altogether. Let's take these unconscious processes, bring them into the light of consciousness. And I didn't mention this earlier, but a wonderful Western analog of Tantra is the alchemical traditions, alchemy, where you work to transform lead into gold. And so in this case, the lead would be me, confused sentient being. I want to transform it into the gold of, in this case, Chenrezig. And so there are so many of these, Richard. I've done dozens of these. There's one for cultivating intellect called Manjushri. There's one for cultivating power, spiritual powers called Vajrapani. As you know, there are dozens and dozens of these archetypes. And so by engaging in these practices, you're stepping up. You're invoking what many contemplatives talk about as the evolutionary vector, stepping up into your potentiality using these kind of spiritual technologies. So it's a colossally big topic, but for a couple of sound bites, maybe that's of some benefit.
Well, thank you. That was very comprehensive. Perhaps we could go back and talk about meditation in a more basic form.
Oh, perfect.
That is to say, what is it supposed to do?
Yeah.
And secondarily, what kind of daily practice would someone in this tradition engage in as a meditative practice?
This tradition meaning Tantra, Vajrayana?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, great question. Yeah. Well, one thing that may not be clear to a bunch of people is that meditation is a multivalent term or a polysemous term. It has so many different meanings depending on different contexts. So it's a little bit like when somebody says sport. Well, what sport are you talking about? There are dozens, if not hundreds, of sports. And so mostly when people think about meditation in the West, almost by default, the definition is either mindfulness or awareness, shamatha or vipassana. And so again, one distinguishing factor or feature of Vajrayana Tantra is its tremendous array of different meditations. But fundamentally, let's get really practical for listeners. My favorite definition of meditation, and there are so many, is habituation to openness. I really quite like that because what it does is it invites us to expand our sense of identity It invites us to open the aperture of our awareness, because one of the reasons we suffer so much is because the lens of our mind, the aperture of our awareness and consciousness is so myopic, it's so constricted. It's a little bit like when you're looking into bright light, your eyes get so constricted, the aperture is so teeny, and we get lost in this limited self-sense that this is all there is me, and then by immediate implication, this kind of external world out there. And so one of the things that meditation does, using this definition, which I like, habituation to openness, is by inviting the heart and mind. And by the way, in both Sanskrit and Pali, as you know, Richard, the word for mind and heart is the same, chitta, or chitta more specifically. And so when we talk about meditation working with the mind, we always have to remember it's really working with the heart. And even in the Tibetan approaches in Eastern, like you go to India, you go to Nepal, you go to Tibet, which I've been to many, many times. It's so fascinating. When people talk about mind, they never point here. It still blows me away. They always point here. They point to your heart. So when we talk about meditation as habituation to openness, this is very helpful. This means the meditation, not only does it open your mind, it opens your heart. And this is where the compassion practices come in. Metta, Maitri, Karuna, all these wonderful meditations that are designed to, again, work more effectively, not just purely cognitively, but affectively. But in a kind of a more colloquial sense, meditation is a marvelous way to become familiar with. In the Tibetan language, this is worth throwing into the mix. The word for meditation in Tibetan is GOM, transliteration. The word provocatively actually means to become familiar with, to become familiar with. And so in almost 50 years of meditation, I have discovered that meditation does two things. It allows you to become familiar with who you are not by a process of progressive disidentification. And by that, what I mean, and this is actually quite important. One of the reasons, again, that we suffer is we have a constricted dimension of consciousness. We think that this body is who we are. Ego. There's an interesting Freudian slip. Freud said this: ego is first and foremost the body ego. So everything is so constricted. And so when we start to work with these opening practices, we're starting to open, we're starting to expand, we're starting to raise the aperture, open the aperture of our awareness so that we can encompass more and more a greater spectrum of our identity. So the first part of meditation is to become familiar with, is becoming familiar with who we are not. I am not this body. Even my colloquialism expresses that. If it's my body, it can't be me. Okay, all right. Well, what's left? Well, I'm my mind, I'm my thoughts, my emotions. Well, again, the colloquialisms also reveal that. If it's my thoughts, my emotions, it can't be me. It's something I possess. Or as Nietzsche put, we are possessed by that which we feel we possess. Our body possesses us. Our thoughts and mental states possess us. And so in a very real way, connected somewhat to the etymology of the word religion, to link back, what meditation does in the process of becoming familiar is we become familiar with who we are not. We kind of back our way into, we retreat, link back by process of elimination to who we really are. And so in a deeper end of meditation, what meditation then does, it allows us to become familiar secondarily with who we really are. This deeper, formless dimension of being that I was intimating somewhat earlier when we talk about the three dimensions of the body and the mind. And so therefore, I see, Richard, I see meditation as this twofold arc, the process, the via negativa, the apophatic way, process of differentiation, letting go of who we think we are, becoming familiar with who we are not. And then at a certain point, reality is pointed out, mind is pointed out, the non-dual state enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, is pointed out. And then we become familiar with that. And I wanted to the reason I throw that into the mix, because this is yet another distinguishing factor of the Tantra of the Vajrayana. And by this, what I mean is the characteristic of Vajrayana is called the fruitional vehicle also, because it starts at the end. So very often, like again, we're doing deity yoga, we're starting with the end product. I am Chenrezig. Or when you're doing some of these other practices, I am the Buddha. I am these transpersonal, transdimensional states. That's who I really am. So a characteristic of Tantra that connects to this is it starts at the end. It starts with sometimes what's called a pointing out transmission of who you really are. And then you work to become more and more familiar with that, hence the deeper rendering of the term meditation. So I'm doing doing a shotgun blast here to a really good question, and I'm happy to track this down in any direction that you think might be of some fruition. There's a lot to say.
Yeah, you do mention, and you've used the term I am a number of times. My impression of Buddhism, pretty much all its forms, is that it denies the existence of this I, the doctrine of anatta, no self.
Right.
Could you relate what you've been saying to that doctrine?
Oh, yes, absolutely, positively. So this is where the very important contribution, not just from Buddhism, but also in the Indic Hindu traditions, is the necessity of centrifuging out the difference between relative and absolute truth. This is actually quite important. Because on a relative level, absolutely we exist. I'm sitting here talking to you over there. We have this relative validity. If we didn't honor the basis of relative truth, we get caught in all kinds of spiritual pathologies, like spiritual bypassing, nihilism, all kinds of dismissive, untoward reactions to the so-called material phenomenal world. But what the great contemplative traditions interject is there isn't just this one bandwidth of relative truth, fake news, fundamentally. It's really fundamentally fake news, but it has a relative validity, right? The great wisdom traditions are more interested in absolute truth, the difference between appearance and reality. So again, we can't deny appearance. I appear, you appear, the world appears. We can't deny that. And so what the wisdom traditions do is they challenge the status of that appearance. And so when you're talking about anatman, now you're starting to talk about absolute truth. You're actually talking about what it was that the Buddha and many other realized masters from many other traditions discovered when they started to look very closely at the nature of their own mind and their own heart. And there is tremendous backing here from the scientific community. Neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, psychology, philosophy. There are so many Western vectors that point to the same thing. The fundamental teaching here is if you take a very, very close look, and this is really the invitation, don't take this as spiritual rhetoric. Look for yourself. If you think you exist, where? Exactly, specifically. You can use tremendous processes of logic here and literally another form of meditation, analytic meditation. Do the investigations. If you think you exist, where? Exactly, precisely. And again, through a process of progressive disidentification, exactly what I was alluding to earlier is the via negativa. I'm not this, I'm not that. Eventually, you can back yourself into the truth. So on a relative level, we say, okay, yes, I seem to exist. And like a good scientist, like a good physicist, hey, let's not take things at face value. Let's really take a look. So you start to take a really good look. Am I my body? No. With some investigation, no. Am I my thoughts on some investigation? No. And so you keep kind of chipping away, cutting away, and eventually you realize this thing called self, it's a narrative, it's a construct. It's basically something that we make up, literally called vikalpa in Sanskrit. Moment to moment to moment, we confabulate, we make up this thing called the self structure. And you can see this in meditation. It's one of the great gifts. So meditation in many real ways is this process of demolition, deconstruction. In fact, my dear friend, Ruben Laukkanen, he's a wonderful cognitive neuroscientist. He has a fantastic line about how this connects to meditation, where he says, resting in the present moment is annihilation. It's an amazing statement. Resting in the present moment is annihilation. And what he's pointing out to is that if you, in fact, do rest one-pointedly in the present moment, the great gift of meditation, the self-sense, the structure, the narrative, the storyline of the self is deconstructed. And so meditation allows you to see what you talk about as anatman. That yes, you appear provisionally. We couldn't function in the world without that relative presentation and relative bandwidth. Ego, when we're talking about atman, ego is just a particular form of arrested development. It's just a arrested form of development. And so what meditation does is it allows us to see that. allows us to transcend but include even the ego structure, even the self-sense. You still have it when you need to relate to other people in this particular way, like you and I. But at a certain point, with a slightly more adult perspective, adult perception, you realize the view is so much better from up here. So something like that. Does that make sense?
Yes, very good, very helpful. Let me ask you to elucidate on one term that you mentioned a little bit earlier in light of all this, which is mind stream.
Oh, Santana. Yeah, exactly.
What is mind stream?
Yeah. These are great questions. So, I think it was William James who coined the great father, really arguably, of American psychology. Brilliant individual. He's the individual, to the best of my understanding, coined the term stream of consciousness. Well, going back, let's try 2,000 years before him, the Buddhists, and not just the Buddhists, but I speak with a little bit more conviction and authority about Buddhism, because that's what I've been studying for 45 years. The Buddhists use the term santana, or mind stream, to talk about that. If you really take a very close look, again, this is something you can see for yourself, there does seem to be this kind of continuity. You just look throughout your life. You can see it's very interesting, actually, Richard, if you take a look. I've done this as a kind of contemplation. Take a look at photographs, take folders of your own pictures going back to infancy until now. And you will see a couple of very interesting things. You will see on one level, yes, I am not the same entity that I was when my baby picture came out. But at the same time, there's something oddly quite constant and familiar. There's some level of continuity, right? So the stream of consciousness is connected to what I mentioned earlier as the Tibetan definition of tantra, which is gyu, which means literally continuity. And so what is so compelling here, deeply connected to what we just talked about, is that the stream of consciousness itself is somewhat illusory in nature. And by that, what I mean is that we feel in an unexamined way, and scientists talk about it they use a very compelling term called flicker fusion. And you'll see how this ties in if you hang with me for just a second. If you take a very close look at the nature of your mind, the nature of your being, and again, scientists can really help us this in the physical world, especially quantum physicists, you will realize that what seems to be continuous is really, and upon examination, is quantized, hence the term quantum. Everything basically is pixelated in nature. As you know, things arise with lightning rapidity out of the zero-point energy field in physics language. Arises, abides, ceases. Arises, abides, ceases. And this happens with such rapidity and such constancy that for the untamed, untrained mind, we feel that there's this unbroken stream of reality and then even of consciousness itself. But again, if you take a very, very close look, this is where the illusion of self itself comes from this seemingly unbroken narrative structure. But you start to take a look at things by slowing things down. So let's take a very interesting, somewhat outdated analogy here. The old movie reel thing, right? 16 to 24 frames per second creates the illusion of continuity. Well, what happens when you slow things down? Well, you start to realize the discontinuous nature. You take it below 16 frames per second, which is kind of a frequency threshold, and you start to then see the pixelated or parsed nature of the phenomenal world, including the self-sense. So how this ties into stream of consciousness, it's really more staccato of consciousness. There seems to be this unbroken stream, but moment to moment to moment, scientists will tell you this. Your individual deep experience in meditation will tell you this. And in fact, the term in Sanskrit is called dharmas, D-H-A-R-M-S. These are atoms of experience. Take a very close look at your mind, and you will realize moment to moment to moment with lightning rapidity, phenomena arises, thoughts arise, images arise, perceptions arise. And what is it that glues the whole thing together? Almost literally confuses it. Speed of mind, literally called flicker fusion in the cognitive scientists. So it's actually the speed of the mind that brings everything together to create this illusion of a stream of consciousness, and therefore stream of everything else. And so this is a really big, deep topic, and I just want to make sure we're taking it in the direction you want to take it with. because physicists have something to say about this, the cognitive neuroscientists have something to say, but really most importantly for us, this has tremendous applicability and validity for how we live our lives, how we relate to self and other. I mean, there's so many, this may seem somewhat abstract, theoretical, well, perhaps only because we haven't experienced it directly. But when you do experience it this way, you start to realize really profound insights into the nature of mind, self-sense, and reality altogether. So these are big questions. So I'm throwing some needles against the wall. I hope they're sticking for you.
Oh, well, so that is fascinating and very enlightening. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah,
let's move on to something else that you mentioned earlier, which is dream yoga.
Oh, yeah.
I believe you practice something called nocturnal meditation. Would you like to go into this subject for us?
Yeah, well, now you're hitting my sweet spot. Yeah, so again, this is a wonderful contribution of the tantric traditions, because as I mentioned earlier, everything becomes the path. Sometimes, again, this is like the fifth synonym for Vajrayana Tantra. Sometimes it's called the quick path. Why? Because everything becomes the path. There's nothing that you're doing that isn't the path or the meditation. And so for me, the nocturnal meditations, this is my languaging, my neologism, this is my wording for 5 types of practices that one can engage in as we fall asleep every single night. And I will briefly mention what these 5 are. And then maybe we can come and talk just a little bit more about like dream yoga, where that fits in, and like why should I do this? Why bother? And most people, when they hear about this, in fact, when I was first exposed to these teachings decades ago, it's like I had no idea that I was sitting on this tremendous wealth of natural resources, and that I could explore my mind and heart in these extremely interesting subtle dimensions every single night when I fall asleep. And so the 5 nocturnal meditations, the first one's called liminal dreaming. And this is the liminal is a word that means threshold. We all know this experience. This is that really interesting kind of plasma of mind, so to speak. When we first lie down, we're not awake, we're not asleep. We're sitting there, and hey, guess what, Richard? What do you start to notice when you're actually sitting there? When you're lying down there, what do you notice? Well, you start to notice the pixelated nature of your mind. You start to notice in liminal dreaming that narrative that creates the self-sense, it starts to fall apart when you're falling asleep. In fact, I'm a member of the American Academy of Sleep Medicine, so I work with insomnia and all its manifestations. If that didn't fall apart, you wouldn't fall asleep. That's what characterizes insomnia. So liminal dreaming is this marvelous dimension where you work with the mind as it expresses itself in the pre and post. So as you're going to sleep and right after you wake up, you're working with your mind as it's going offline during the day, threshold between waking and sleeping, and as it's coming back online, threshold from dreaming to waking. And so what you can do here that's so fascinating is exactly what I said. You can sit back and develop a kind of witnessing awareness type of distance perspective, where you watch your mind just like you do in meditation, and you can actually see pages being ripped out of the narrative of the self-sense. And you start to realize, oh my gosh, this thing called Andrew really is a construct. And so with some meditative sensitivity in the liminal state, you start to see this in brilliant color. I'll come back to that in a second because there's more to say it, and I want to say it because people can work with this. With a little bit of familiarity, and again, these classifications are not cold and fast, you can then progress into the famous lucid dreaming. That's the second one. And there's so much study on this, so many books, scientifically proven in the 70s. This is that marvelous dimension. I'm sure many listeners here have had that experience because guess what? Meditators have more lucid dreams, and there's a reason for that. The more you meditate, the more you have lucidity. Why? Because lucidity is nothing more than a code word for awareness. A lucid dream is an aware dream. What are you doing when you're working with meditation? You're working with awareness. Hence, a more heightened, aware relationship to the contents of the mind during the day naturally reveals itself as a proficiency in lucid dreaming at night. But in short, lucid dreaming, you're in a dream, and then either spontaneously or through lucid dreaming practices, something will clue you into the fact that you're dreaming, and you wake up and you're still in the dream. It's like the movie Inception, right? You're dreaming, you wake up in the dream, you know you're dreaming, And so then you can take control over the dreamscape. And there is so much to say here. But basically, briefly, lucid dreaming and mind mapping, largely psychological in nature, largely for purposes of self-fulfillment. It has tremendous entertainment value, there's a vast array of incredibly interesting things you can do that we can talk about. But with a little bit of proficiency in lucid dreaming, then the next step is dream yoga. And this is now where you work with lucidity for the purposes of spiritual transformation. So it's no longer psychological as in lucid dreaming, it's now more spiritual. Not so interested in self-fulfillment, but self-transcendence. And so dream yoga is, I've written 3 books on this topic. Dream yoga is a marvelously profound arena to really explore using the laboratory of the nocturnal mind, the very nature of mind, and by implication, reality. It's beyond profound. With a little bit of familiarity in dream yoga, then one can progress into the next stage. And now we're entering graduate school. Sometimes I refer to these meditations as a type of night school, right? So now you're entering a graduate school, which is called sleep yoga, or in Tibetan, the word is luminosity yoga. And Richard, there are some big time science labs, big time philosophers actively working as we speak to scientifically prove lucid sleep. And what this is, as unbelievable as it may seem, is that advanced meditators, people who really, 20, 30, 40,000 hours of practice, not only do they attain awareness, lucidity in the dream state, where all their dreams are lucid, but believe it or not, and there are people now, they can bring them into the labs and they can test them. They send signals. It's incredibly fascinating. The data, when it comes out, my friend Tom Metzinger, one of the world's leading theoretical philosophers, I agree with him. He says, when this is scientifically verified, this will be a revolution in the mind sciences. I totally agree. But the idea here is you maintain, believe it or not, a lucidity awareness, even in deep, dreamless sleep. You may ask, well, why do you want to do that? Well, if you're interested, we can talk about that. Just to complete the picture, and then I'll pause for a second. The last one is a specifically Tibetan contribution. These other 4 you can get in other traditions. But the last one is a specific Tibetan contribution, and this is what's called Bardo yoga. That's the 5th one, where Bardo is a word that means gap in between transitional process. And whoa, how does this connect to what we were talking about before? Well, Bardos are in fact those tiny little gaps that arise between every moment of perception, between every moment of thought, and if you believe in this sort of thing, between every life. So Bardo basically relates to the gap between 2 different states of consciousness. And so Bardo yoga is fundamentally a way to work with a nocturnal mind as a way to prepare for death. And even Greek intellectual theory and philosophy, mythology has something to say here, because in the Greek world, Thanatos is the Greek god of death. Hypnos is the Greek god of sleep. What's their relationship? Well, they're not just merely brothers, they're twins. So there's a very intimate connection between sleeping, dreaming, and dying. And so the Tibetans engage the nocturnal mind. They literally talk about death as the dream at the end of time. And so they use the nighttime dream, what they sometimes call the example dream or the double delusion, as a way to extrapolate insights into the primary dream, that's this waking state, and then pinging it forward into the death state, the after-death state, if you believe in it, what's called the dream at the end of time. So that's a lot. I'll pause for a second. I'm more than thrilled to talk about any of these in more detail, but I also want to make sure we're going where you want to take it. One last thing here is that just like the narrative of the 3 yanas connects, transcend but include, each one of these 5 meditations has that same kind of trajectory. That lucid dreaming transcends but includes liminal dreaming, dream yoga transcends but includes all, the 2, and then Bardo yoga transcends but includes the previous 4. So it has that particular type of kind of pattern in and of itself. So there's lots more to say here, but I want to make sure we're going in the right direction for you.
Well, it's fascinating, and I think we could talk about this for hours, but in the context of the amount of time we actually have, why don't we go on to the subject of the pitfalls, dangers, and traps Westerners can fall into with these practices?
Now, you mean practices altogether, or meditation altogether, or the nocturnal?
Well, let's stick with Vajrayana tantric.
Yeah. Well, I mean, one is as you might suspect. One of the, I mentioned that Vajrayana Tantra is called a quick path. The analogy, Richard, that's sometimes given is it's like the difference between driving across the country in a beat up Volkswagen Beetle or taking a Concorde supersonic. You can get there in 2 weeks, or you can get there in 2 hours. One of the pitfalls in the West is that we tend, and this is a kind of an orienting generalization, it's not categorically true, but I think, Westerners, in my experience, they tend to be a little bit impatient. There tends to be sometimes a subliminal sense of superiority, that, I don't have to do all the preparatory work as these Asians do. I'm a modern, hip Westerner raised in the scientific culture. I can skip over all this stuff and I can go right to the tantric goodies, right? And what I say to that is, well, get back to me and let me know how that goes. Because again, if one does not harness the electricity, the power of these tantric meditations properly, you have to handle this stuff with tremendous care. Because if you don't, and I've seen this in the business, so to speak, I can talk I can't reveal names, but I can mention tons of personal relationships with people who go in with maybe not the best attitude, maybe not the best intentionality. And instead of having these practices light you up, they burn you up because you simply haven't done the preparatory work. It's a little bit like, well, you want to understand differential equations in linear algebra calculus. Well, you better do your arithmetic first. You better do your algebra first. And so this is what's so beautiful about these practices. If they're done properly and carefully, they are the most, in my estimation, powerful, transformative spiritual technologies ever devised by the human spirit, in my estimation. But just like really powerful medicine, if you don't, I'm mixing metaphors, if you don't have a really good physician who prescribes it appropriately, that would be a good teacher. If you don't use it as directed, I'm a doc, I used to write prescriptions. If you don't follow the directions, well, you know what's going to happen. And so that is, I see this all the time. People rush, they jump over the preliminaries. They forget that in order to do it, you have to have tremendous grounding in the Theravada and Hinayana practices. You have to have tremendous compassion. This is the thing that's always missed. In fact, a famous teacher, Trungpa Rinpoche, once said very beautifully here, he said, practicing the Vajrayana without compassion, bodhicitta, the Mahayana principles, is like having a super modern house with every conceivable electrical gadget, but no hookup. Nothing works, right? Because you're missing the common ingredients of tremendous stability from the Theravadan approaches, the compassion and love and devotion that you're not doing this for yourself, you're doing this for other people, that comes from the Mahayana. You do that kind of work when you enter Tantra, then the rocket fuel, then you can take that Concorde from here to the awakened state. The other thing, and this is so worth saying, is that this now applies not only to Tantra, but to all spiritual approaches that I see in the West, is that the spiritual traditions, as I've come to understand them, they work primarily with states of consciousness. And I've been intimating the 3 principal states: waking, dreaming, and deep dreamless sleep. You can increase the granularity and come up with a dozen different states, but those are the 3 most general states. The so-called Eastern traditions are specialists with working with states of consciousness and bringing, in fact, as I suggested earlier, lucidity awareness to all 3 states. But unfortunately, what they are blind to, and this is a massive contribution from the West, this is a really big blind spot that I see in a lot of Eastern teachers, especially the Western ones who think they can just hopscotch over this. There's quite a difference between states of consciousness and structures of consciousness. And by this, what I mean is you can have a very high level state experience. You can have an experience of being Chenrezi. You can have an experience of being the Buddha, being the universe. Let's just go to the top. You dissolve into complete non-duality. You have a complete 100% authentic experience. It's not stable. That's the difference between experience and realization. Experience is, it's transient. 100% legitimate. It's actually not that hard to do because it's the natural space. But then here's where the trouble starts. Unless you remain in silence, unless you stay basically doing nothing, the minute you open your mouth, the minute you do anything, you have no choice but to express your experience through your structural level of development. And pardon the expression, but this is where the crap show starts. Because you can have a very high state level experience. It's not even stable. It's not realization, it's experience. You come down, you have no choice because you don't look at structures of consciousness, they're archetypal blind spots. You look through them. As hundreds of developmentalists, and I can name 24 of them off the top of my head, from the beginning of the century and even earlier, have mapped out all these incredibly cross-cultural levels of development. Jean Gebser is probably the one most commonly quoted, the great anthropologist. You go from archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, integral. All these different dimensions of evolutionary psychological growth that one goes through. So I throw this into the mix because this is the only thing I've ever come across that can explain these endless, relentless scandals, problems. Happens all the time. And it's happened in my community as a Tibetan tantric practitioner. Two of the biggest communities in the Western world, their leaders have both just been burned because they've taken abuse of their students, and there is just tremendous hardship and pain. And so that happens because people have these high-level realization, or I should say experiences. They don't realize the limited dimension of their structural level of development. And so they translate that experience through a somewhat developmentally arrested state. And that's where all the problems start. And so this really becomes a problem in Tantra because you feel like, again, many people, oh, I'm a Westerner. I'm just going to jump all the way and do these inner heat yogas. I'm going to do these sexual practices. I'm going to do whatever. Well, these are really powerful methods that absolutely positively not only do you have to abide by the safeguards in the Eastern approaches, but in my estimation, you have to be extremely aware of the limitations of psychospiritual development using the contributions from the West. And to me, this is really helpful. Study the great developmentalists and realize for yourself, again, don't take my word for this, see if it's not true. Have these experiences, you have no choice but to translate them into your world through your structural level of development. So this is my friend John Wellwood, the great psychologist and practitioner, talked about these as the two vectors of waking up, that's the state vector, versus growing up, that's the structure vector, or vertical and horizontal enlightenment. You need this integral approach to understand both, because otherwise you get what you're getting in the world today. So I wanted to run with that a little bit, because to me, this is a big deal, and it will save people a lot of time and trouble and a lot of heartbreak, and will also help them understand these endless problems and scandals that continue to happen in the so-called spiritual communities.
Well, that's marvelous. I can really see how important what you just said is, and certainly very enlightening and illuminating for me personally. Let me ask a question that's probably related,
okay,
which is some of this that you're talking about has to do with, shall we say, cultural embedment. That is to say, Tibetan Buddhism is very much embedded in a culture that is unlike our own as imaginable. And all of this, which is with its cultural trappings, its gods, its, practically everything has been transposed into a society that is almost diametrically opposite.
Yep.
And one question that this arises is, well, how much of this that you bring over is merely cultural, shall we say, embedment, and how much of it is essential? And how do you bridge that gap? Could you explain a little bit about that?
Oh, these are great questions, my friend. This is spot on. Yeah, this is a fantastically important question. This is the difference between deep structures and surface structures. And so, in fact, interestingly enough, when I'm asked to give my bio and like what I do, and like one of the things I look at myself now these days is an actual cultural translator. I mean, I look at taking some of these wisdom traditions, and not just Tibetan Buddhism, non-dual Shaiva Tantra, Advaita Vedanta. I mean, if there's truth, man, I'm going to study it. I don't care where it comes from, right? And so I have noticed, because of my perhaps facility in the Western academic and scientific languages, that I can bridge a little bit between these two streams of wisdom and knowledge. And so I look at part of my work as actually doing a little bit what you're even intimating is this kind of cultural translation project. And this is tremendously important because, yes, I bow to the great wisdom of the tradition of Tibetan Buddhism, but boy, did you nail it. I mean, you walk into a Tibetan shrine room and it's wild, colorful, bizarre. I mean, the chanting, I mean, it's just like you said, it's about as far away as you can get from Western, even religious practices. And so what one then has to do, and this becomes a very delicate, interesting dance. One then, this is my bias, this is the way I roll with it. Then what I see is in fact exactly what you're saying. How can we centrifuge out what is the surface structure, what is relegated to the cultural container of the East, and then bring it into this West, jettisoning some of these cultural aspects that really don't apply to the West. I mean, for instance, I'm not even, you could say I'm a Tibetan Buddhist, but no, I'm not. I'm an American studying a form of Buddhism known as Tibetan. And so if you've been to Asia, one of the great, beautiful things about traveling throughout Asia, I made it a real charter. I've been to like 30 countries there. I've worked in a bunch of them, is it's fantastically beautiful to see how Buddhism flows from one country to the next. It's almost as if Buddhism, think of it like water, the nourishing wisdom water. And the Burma that you get in Sri Lanka is really different than the Buddhism you get in Nepal, than what you get in Burma, than what you get in Thailand. And so what I've noticed is as wisdom tradition flows into these cultures, one of the genius aspects of this, so to speak, is that properly adapted, translated, Buddhism will flow into the container into which it is embedded. And right now, this is an open question for us in the West, is it not? I mean, Buddhism is very young, less than, maybe a little bit more than 100 years, depending on where you land it. Have we, in fact, been able to culturally translate? Have we been, in fact, able to bring this massive wisdom tradition into the West? Not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right? See, that's the trick, because you want to maintain the essence, but you don't need to get hooked up with all the crazy rituals and the deities. And this is one reason there's some credibility. I say this with some restraint with what's called secular Buddhism, which is where, let's just get rid of all the deities, get rid of karma, get rid of the notion of rebirth. I think that's where the adaptation turns into high-level editing, and that becomes somewhat problematic. But this is a very deep, thorny question. I think fundamentally here, what we have to do is work for ourselves. This is the great non-theistic gift of the Buddhist tradition, is do some of the work yourself. Find out what aspect of these teachings resonates with you. Find out what presses your buttons. Find out what stretches you. Work with others of like mind. Work with perhaps a guide, or if you can find a skillful teacher you trust. And then you will find your own way. And yes, it might take a little bit more time to do that, but that also brings about a lot more veracity and traction for you because you're doing the work yourself. So I'll pause there for a second, Richard, because it's such a big, important question and topic. I just want to make sure I'm heading in the right direction for you. I think it's a critical issue these days. But one last thing here.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
To me, the two biggest kind of cultural holding environments for Buddhism, especially Tibetan Buddhism, is psychology and science. And that's why so much like Trungpa Rinpoche and other teachers, they often work with the Buddhist and Tibetan Buddhist teachings within with a psychological vocabulary, using that particular milieu. I think that has tremendous validity because, again, psychology is working with mind. And my understanding of it is just psychological approaches are just examining a particular bandwidth within the developmental spectrum. And so therefore, there should be no contradiction there. The other one that there's a tremendous amount of traffic with, of course, is science. And there's a lot of traffic for years. Many people have said, Buddhism is just a science of mind. Well, really sophisticated thinkers like Evan Thompson and others say you can't quite say that. But what you can say, and this is where the conflation and confusion comes in, is that Buddhism is empirical. It's based on experience. The last things allegedly that the Buddha said was, I've given you everything. Don't take my teachings on face value. Work out your own salvation with diligence. That's an empirical approach. It's like, hey, I'm presenting a particular hypothesis, theory. It's called enlightenment. It's called love, compassion, and a happy life. Here's the experiment. Go work with your mind and the heart like I did, and then, conjoin your insights with like-minded practitioners, exactly the methods of proof and validation that take place, by the way, in science, and then see if it works for you. So in that regard, the empirical nature of both Buddhism and science is where this conflation comes in. When people say, well, Buddhism is a science of mind. Slightly different topic. I don't think you can quite go that far. But I do think this is one reason Buddhism is becoming popular in the West, is because it has this kind of footing in both the psychological traditions, especially transpersonal psychology, and then especially things like quantum theory and cognitive neuroscience. I mean, the resonances between quantum theory, especially Carlo Rovelli's relational interpretation of quantum mechanics, and the fundamental teachings of emptiness in Buddhism there's something really profound going on there. But I'll pause for a second there, Richard, because it's another really great topic.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to leave. I think we should wrap up because of time pressures.
Okay.
But I want to pursue one thing about this cultural dichotomy, because it seems to me the greatest problem of this cultural embeddedness has to do with guru yoga and all that it entails. And, on one level, yes, the student is told, well, the guru is, really you, or, sometimes it envisages Padmasambhava or whoever. But a lot of times the actual human lama is venerated. You do prostrations to the lama as an embodiment of the teaching.
That's right.
Now, in America, this is a problem because the idea that all men are created equal is so radically ingrained in us that there seems to be, I think, some sort of inner conflict is almost bound to arise. Could you comment on that issue?
Oh, man, these are such big, enormous topics. And yes, oh my gosh, I completely concur. The whole issue of guru principle and the role of love and devotion here. Well, so briefly, really, really big topic. So one of the things, again, tying into like what makes Tantra unique, and this is not just Buddhist Tantra, it's the same in Hindu Tantra, actually, is the power and the role of the guru, the teacher, literally guru, the supposed, alleged, and that's the thing, right? Embodiment of the awakened principle. And so one of the things that is core, especially to Tibetan Buddhism, completely resonant with bhakti yoga in Hinduism, is in fact guru yoga, devotion, using the most powerful force in the universe, which is what? Love. Harnessing the power of love for the purposes of awakening. And so the real trick here is, and when you're doing, again, if you're doing this right, Richard, there's no problem here, because if you're doing this right, and again, most people in the impatient West don't do it, there's actually, I can only take this metaphor so far, but you get the idea. There's this kind of dating period. If you're really doing this properly with a teacher, in fact, in the classic text, it says the student should study the teacher for 12 years. The teacher should study the student for 12 years. Well, we're impatient. We're speed daters. And so if you engage the guru principle properly, you get to know them, you date them, you romance them a little bit. And at a certain point, when you've kicked the tires, you've asked the hard questions, then you can get married. That type of marriage, called samaya in Sanskrit, applies to both Hindu and Buddhist Tantra. That is incredibly powerful. The power of commitment, the power of devotion, if it's done right, that's thermonuclear. But you can see, oh my gosh, is this rife for distortion and perversion in the West? Absolutely, positively. The other thing that's really helpful to keep in mind here is, and I've reflected on this a lot, is all these texts that talk about, oh, I should completely capitulate to the wisdom of the teacher. I should never challenge. I should see my teacher as the living Buddha, especially when it comes to women. Well, who wrote these texts? These are all written in a patriarchal environment. These are all written by men who basically, hey, come on, right? I would go back and argue, honestly, if I could go back in time and say, I really like to sit down with this person and craft a psychograph and try to figure out where this person was in a structural level development when they came up with these sorts of things. So this is one of these incredibly thorny topics that it's difficult to do a soundbite answer. But let me just say one thing that you suggested at the outset that's absolutely worth reinstating. And that is that, at least in the Tibetan world, there are 4 types of guru. And these are helpful to know. One is the provisional external agent. And because we believe in externality, because we're dealing with projective things, it's helpful to use that training wheel. No doubt about it. The teacher has tremendous power. Then there's the teacher, the guru, as the sacred text, the Dharma. You actually revere the text as the teacher. The latter 2 forms of guru are really the most interesting to me. You alluded to one, but here's another one. The third type is what's called symbolic guru, where the guru, with a really sensitive relationship to reality, the phenomenal world becomes your teacher. I mean, the great meditation master Milarepa said it beautifully. Phenomena are all the book one needs. And you can cultivate a highly open, again, habituation to openness, a relationship to your world, where you start to realize, and again, this leads to a really interesting topic, the world is not made of matter, the world is made of mind. You start to realize that you have this capacity to interrelate with your environment as your teacher. We know this through synchronicities and auspicious coincidences anyway. You can cultivate this relationship. But by far, all 3 of these teachers, these 3 gurus, as you mentioned, they're all provisional. They all fundamentally point to the ultimate guru, which is within you. That's fundamentally where you really take fundamental refuge. And so we use these 3 forms of training wheels until we finally get the conviction that, oh my gosh, I really am the awakened one. I really am the Buddha, the Christ, whatever. They're all cross-dressers to me. I already have this innate wisdom and compassion and power. I just don't believe it. But with that said, Richard, this is, it's difficult for me because these questions are so deep, they're so beautiful, that a challenge for me is I don't want to just toss out slick sound bites to a question and a topic that's very profound. Suffice it to say, the guru principle goes back to a number of wisdom traditions for thousands of years. It's there for a reason. It has a lot of power. If it's engaged, used as directed, right? And that's the kicker. Is no, whatever. And so used as directed, the guru principle, the power of love and devotion, is phenomenally important because what opens you more than anything but love? If meditation is habituation to openness, the Buddha is the ultimate opened one, when do you actually feel the most open? When you're in love. Immediate near enemy, openness means vulnerability. And that's where the problems come. Mm-hmm. So I'll pause there because, again, I want to try to at least say something that's cogent to you and your listeners, but also I want to acknowledge the depth, the nuance, the thorniness of these types of things, and not just gloss over them with slick sound bites. So,
well, I have to follow up on this because this issue is generally approached from the perspective of the student. Well, but as you yourself have alluded, the lamas themselves often become distorted and fall into really dysfunctional situations.
Totally.
So I really have to ask at this point, does the cultural, shall we say, embeddedness of the United States really fit the guru concept as imported from Tibet?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm agnostic on that. This remains to be seen. That type of cultural transposition hopefully shouldn't be an imposition. And in fact, can Westerners relate in this way? I think this is just purely me on a kind of mass market level. No, I don't think so. I mean, you have to remember that Tantra, again, where things like Guru Yoga and the like were practiced, these were yogic forest traditions. They weren't meant for mass consumption. That's the other thing that's really in order here. These practices were in the forest, in the jungle, away even from classic monasticism. These things were really fundamentally for, I don't want to use the word elite, but these were relegated to practitioners who weren't part of the massive kind of cultural situation. And so I think in that regard, Richard, that in a cultural way in the West, in a large kind of mass market way, I don't think so. I really don't, because it's just so rife with so many problems. And you just have to look around to see the truth of that, right? It continually happens. and it's not going to stop. So I think if it's held, again, within a proper framework, within a limited environment, proper set and setting, if you want to use that term, and really done the way the physician, the Buddhists call the divine physician, the way the divine physician handed out these prescriptions, if they're used as directed, they're unbelievably powerful. I don't think this is a prescription that fits, and I think I'm hearing this from you, cross-culturally in a mass setting in the West. And so far, the data and statistics and the damage, the heap of hurt that's taking place seems to bear that out, right? I'm curious, what do you think?
But I wasn't talking about mass market exposure.
Oh, okay.
I was talking about we're talking about actual institutes where these problems have arisen with lamas and very dedicated students.
Right.
It's not like, you've just gotten all of Taylor Swift's fans in, they're not going to really understand it. We're talking about people who are already committed and who are already exercise a certain amount of devotion. So how do you, it's starting not to look too good.
Yes, and that's where you have to be, again, the Dalai Lama says this with tremendous rigor. He says, don't be afraid to continually kick the tires. Don't be afraid to continually ask the hard questions. Don't be afraid to challenge. And in fact, if there's a teacher who isn't open to that, who isn't amenable to these types of direct, challenges, really, I would say that's a good time to walk the other direction. I mean, if you have a legitimate teacher, they're going to be there for you and they're going to be willing. And I speak with direct experience. I trust me on this. I've had both. I've had experiences with people like, whoa, I'm not going to touch this person with a 10-foot pole. Unfortunately, others, they get kind of sucked in. Conversely, I've been with other, what I would consider 100% legitimate teachers where I feel nothing but love and compassion. And with a person like that, I'm around them enough. It's like, hey, I can fall in love with this person. I trust this person. So it's somewhat difficult to give carte blanche categorical answers. I think these are idiosyncratic situations where, one has to be, I would say as Westerners, and I've written on this, I just submitted a big article on this, is the West ready for Tantra? And the Guru principle is one of the biggest reasons I think it's not. That do not be afraid, for those who are listening, ask the tough questions, challenge them, look at the senior students, there's ways to test the veracity of a teacher. How much love and compassion, how much service, how much are they doing to help others? How much are they walking the talk? How much do they circle the wagons? And how much is there this elite, I just got to get closer to the guru thing? I mean, if you just pay attention to these kind of metrics, you can be careful, you'll be okay. But here's the other thing that happens, bringing the psychological end of it, is a lot of people on the West, they just heap the poor teacher with all their projections, all their transferences, all the psychological stuff that happens that makes it a tremendous hornet's nest. They put all their eggs in that one basket, and then, of course, the basket's going to break. So this is one of the most intractably difficult issues in Western spirituality, in my opinion, and also one of the most important because, again, if it's done properly, tremendous transformative potential, but also tremendous deleterious potential. And we see this with all the scandals that continue to happen. So for people listening, read what the Dalai Lama says about this. Ask the tough questions, challenge your teacher. And if there isn't a proper receptivity to that, that's when it's time to walk. And even if you're involved and you see these things, trust your intuition, trust your inner guru. Work with your dreams to tie it back into dream yoga. One of the great gifts of that mechanism is you work with your own unconscious mind. You can incubate these dreams. You can get this guidance. Trust the ultimate guru within. Pay attention to that intuitive feeling. And if it feels fishy, it probably is fishy. And then it's time to walk. In my opinion, when in doubt, leave it out, especially in the West these days. Don't you think?
Yeah, that's great. This has all been wonderful, and I think we have pretty much run out of time.
Okay.
So obviously we could go on much longer with any of this stuff, but this has been extraordinarily enlightening, extraordinarily interesting. So I've certainly learned a great deal from it. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Well, Richard, I appreciate it. And honestly, I'm not patronizing when I say this. the nuance, the subtlety of your questions and the depth is really what made this an interesting conversation. So I very much appreciate that and the integrity that you bring to the interview itself. So it's been an honor and delight. Thank you so much.
Thank you. For me too.
Take care.
I certainly hope you enjoyed that wonderful conversation. Two brilliant minds sharing some very inspiring and deep thoughts. Food for the heart. I'd like you, if you can, to join me Thursday next week when we will have Eduardo Javier Gramalia speaking on the wisdom of the Bhagavad Gita. We have had Eduardo speak for us on previous occasion. He is a brilliant man, and I do hope you can join us Thursday next week. In the meantime, stay safe and be well. Good night to you all.